United Kingdom stops active recruitment of Nigeria's health workers. Ogun PDP Assembly candidates drag INEC APC to tribunal. APC asked tribunal to dismiss 3 opposition parties' petitions against Tinubu. And outside of Nigeria, German Ambassador Jean-Christian Gordon-Kirk expelled from Chad. And hundreds protest detention of Tunisian president's critics. The phrase fuel subsidy is one that ignites different opinions whenever it comes up. And while Nigerians wait to see how the incoming administration of President-elect Bola Ahmed Tinubu will handle the issue, Nigeria has received a staggering sum to scale up the national social program ahead of the removal of fuel subsidy. And as the countdown to swearing-ins slowly but surely moves towards May 29th, the makeup of the leadership of the 10th National Assembly continues to garner interest. More people are making their interests known. But what will carry the day? Free voting, party decisions, regional interests, religious concerns, or something else? Tonight, we also look at how the leadership race is shaping up. My guests tonight are Dr. Muda Yusuf, CEO of the Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprise, and Kasim Afegbua, former PDP member and public affairs analyst. This is Politics HQ. I'm Tolulope. Adeleru-Balogun. Welcome to the show. Now, the history of subsidies in Nigeria dates back to the 1970s when they were introduced in response to the oil price shock of 1973. There were more subsidies under the Ibrahim Babangida regime in the early 1990s. And since then, Nigeria has spent billions of dollars and trillions of naira feeding what has become a popular but costly policy. Despite numerous attempts at reform, Nigeria has never successfully removed fuel subsidies, in large part due to the strong popular opposition to reform. But the fuel subsidy train could be coming to a stop. Africa's biggest economy set aside 3.36 trillion naira, about $7.3 billion this year, to spend on petrol subsidies until mid-2023, after which it has made no provision for the expense, which costs more than Nigeria's spending on healthcare and education. And now the government has received $800 million from the World Bank to scale up a national social program ahead of the expected end of the fuel subsidy. Dr. Muda Yusuf, CEO of the Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprise, joins me now to discuss the potential way forward and Nigeria's fuel subsidy. Dr. Yusuf, welcome to Politics HQ once again. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much.
So the way fuel subsidy has been handled in Nigeria has really put the country in a serious bind, particularly financially. Subsidies like this come at a great cost. So Dr. Yusuf, let's start from there. With so much money going into subsidy over the years, where has it not been going? Because in terms of having to fuel the subsidy, that means Nigeria has been taking money or at least not putting money in other areas. So what other areas or sectors have suffered for Nigeria to keep the subsidy?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Practically all sectors have suffered because if we have an economy where our revenue has averaged between 6 to 7 trillion actual revenue, and we are spending about 6 trillion for purposes of subsidy, you can imagine what you call the opportunity cost in economies. And what I mean by that is the things that we forgo annually. I mean, what we spend on maybe capital projects for Federal Ministry of Works, at best between 500 to 600 billion. We spend even less when you talk of health, when you talk of education, when you talk of security. So a whole lot of areas in the economy have suffered in terms of inadequate funding, partly as a result of this expenditure on subsidy. That is just one component of the challenge that this subsidy regime has been creating. The second major component is the macroeconomic challenges that is creating. Because when you have an economy where almost 80% of your revenue is being used to service debt. An economy where the central bank is providing funding to fill a lot of financing gap. As we speak, over the last few years, the central bank has funded the government to the tune of over 20 trillion, which you call ways and means. An economy where the deficit keeps climbing and all of that. All of these things are consequences of the amount that we spend on subsidy to a large extent. Because if you had sufficient revenue, the need for borrowing, the need for incurring debt, servicing debt, and all of those things will not be there. But if the fiscal space has been so narrowed down, because the bulk of the revenue has been used to be paying for subsidy, then you have a major macroeconomic problem. So there's a nexus between the way we spend and what is happening to our exchange rate, what is happening to inflation, what is happening to the situation where the central bank has to be providing funding to fill the gaps, what is happening to our debt burden, high debt service. All of these things are connected. The third very important point is the fact that the regime of subsidy has practically obstructed investment, private investment in the oil and gas sector. Because you cannot have an economic environment or a sector where you dictate price to investors. It doesn't happen. So what we have seen over the years is that we don't have private investors, that are very active in the petroleum downstream. That is why up till now, almost 60 years into oil production, we don't have any serious private refinery. It's only recently we now began to have some modular refineries, and of course, we now have the Dangote refinery, which is in the free trade zone. So these are consequences of the subsidy regime. No investment. So we are now stuck with NNPC. We are stuck with only the government refineries, which have not functioned for close to a decade. And we have been putting a whole lot of money in it. So the subsidy regime has brought a whole lot of problems to the economy, not to talk of issues of smuggling, issues of corruption, and so on.
Okay.
So we need to look at it just beyond the amount we are saving. We need to look at it holistically and the impact it's having on the entire economy.
So, Dr. Muda, Yusuf, you talk about the issues and sort of like the problems that the subsidy has brought about. But the whole idea at the end of the day, or the beginning of the day in this situation, was to cushion the effects of oil price shock as it is. Nigeria being an oil-dependent country in terms of the revenue we bring in for very many years now. But the question has remained, to the largest point, who actually does benefit from Nigeria's fuel subsidy? It's such a very popular policy, but one that is costly. But there's been conversations over the past few years and even research that says it's not actually who government says benefits, who actually benefits. So let's take that as well as part of this conversation. Who's been benefiting from the subsidy for the fuel subsidy in Nigeria?
Those who benefit from the fuel subsidy regime are those who consume the PMS the most. In other words, the subsidy, there's a correlation between the amount of petrol, PMS or petrol that we consume individually and the amount of subsidy that we get. Therefore, the more we consume, the more subsidy we get. So we translate that to the general populace. The people who consume the most of the petrol are the people who have cars. And we have some of them have multiple cars. Many of them have big SUVs with a tank that can be as high as 150 liters. Some of them ride in convoys, they ride in pilot cars and all of that. Some of these can be riding in a convoy of 10 vehicles. So when you look at the real beneficiaries, they're actually those between the middle class and the upper class. Because in terms of consumption, they are the ones that consume the most. The ordinary Nigerians, some of them go in buses. an 18-seater bus, for instance, maybe has a tank of about maybe 40 liters. It's going with almost 18 people all over the place. Or you have an SUV that it can just one person and it has a tank of 150 liters. There's one for the children, there's one for the wife, there's one for Ghana, there's some for the pilot cars. So to answer your question, the biggest beneficiaries of the subsidy are those who consume the PMS the most. Mm-hmm. And those who consume most of the petrol are the middle to the upper class. But the issue is that the issue has become so emotive.
Yes.
Because of the poverty situation. So this argument I'm presenting, if you go on the street and say it, not many people will believe you. Because they feel that things are hard and the capacity to absorb more shocks is very limited. So there's a lot of emotion around this, and a lot of people also stoke this, maybe for some personal interest and all of that.
Okay.
But it is not in the medium to long-term interest of the economy for this situation to continue. Mm-hmm. So that is why we need to, engage, discuss, and move forward on it.
So before we move forward, because what we see is that, interestingly enough, the decision or the end of the road might be with the next president. The Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Zainab Ahmed, noted that when the administration was working on the 2023 Medium-Term Expenditure Framework and the Appropriation Act, they only made provision for Nigeria to have fuel subsidy up to June 2023. So that's about 2 months from now, and that will be shortly after President-elect Tinubu is expected to be sworn in. But this is an administration that had 8 years to address the subsidy issue, and yes, let's give it to them. They did attempt once or twice, but they seem to have just simply kicked the can down the road for the next administration. Do you think that the Buhari administration may have missed some opportunities to go ahead and remove the subsidy in a way that might have softened the blow? But now we have Russia, Ukraine, we have global economic headwinds, we have revenue, yes, of course, not meeting some of the expectations.
There must have been some missed opportunities. I don't know whether you can still hear me.
I can hear you. Go ahead.
Certainly, there has been some missed opportunities because, the Buhari government has been there getting close to 8 years now. Now, what reason are we going to give to justify the fact that the refineries have not worked up until now? All the refineries have not worked. 8 years. So if we are talking about an opportunity that has been missed, I think that is one big opportunity. Because if there is real commitment to it, at least some of the refineries have been working such that we will not be in a situation where we are importing 100% of our petroleum product needs. So for me, that is the major failure of the government in this area. Because if you had been refining locally, it could have been easier to get the union and some stakeholders on board and say, okay, now we have made this progress. Even if the domestic refining capacity cannot meet all the entire domestic demand, and then if you can meet it substantially, then we can move on from there. But how do we explain a situation where all the refineries up till now has not worked? So that for me is a major concern. And that is why some of us are saying that we cannot leave this sector in the hand of government. We cannot leave it in the hands of NNPC. Let us decouple the sector from the government, from the bureaucracy, from politicians. Let the private sector take charge of it. Let the private sector invest in the way they have invested in telecoms, in the way they have invested in broadcasting, in the way they have been investing in education, in health, in practically all spheres of in aviation. The private sector is doing a whole lot in all these sectors. But when you have a policy that is blocking the entrance of the private sector into a very important sector of the economy, it's not doing the economy any good. So we need to move beyond the emotions and the sentiments that people, argue about this matter. And let us do what is right for this generation and for the next generation of Nigerians.
Okay.
And the only way to do that is to allow the private sector to come in. And to allow the private sector to come in, we have to remove the subsidy.
So let's get to that now.
That is the issue.
So let's get to that, because President-elect Tinubu has said he believes the subsidy doesn't in fact benefit the poor and he will remove it, even though in 2012 he was one of those who was very vocally opposed to the removal of subsidy then. So we received this $800 million from the World Bank, and the minister Zainab Ahmed said that there will be cash transfers to about 50 million Nigerians, the most vulnerable in society, to cushion them. They're also looking to do more. So there are suggestions of labor working on mass transit for its members, or even the new administration giving public sector workers pay rises after removing subsidy in June. At the end of the day, this is going to fall on President-elect Tinubu's desk in the coming months. What's the best way we should go about this? Do you see cash transfers, mass transit, increases in salary for public servants being the things that will help soften the blow?
Well, first of all, the issue of the palliatives and the amount that has been given by the World Bank, either as a loan or as a grant, but I think it is more of a loan.
Yeah.
I think it is better left for the incoming administration to handle. Because I heard the minister talking about having a register, giving money to about 10 million households and all of that. I think since the challenge of managing this subsidy issue is now with the incoming administration, whatever intervention or arrangement that will be done in terms of palliatives, I think it is better left to the incoming administration to handle. Because there are all sorts of issues around the social investment program. There are issues about the integrity of the register that the minister was talking about. There are issues around even the entire framework of the spending of the social investment program. So it is better, even if the fund has been secured, it should be left when the new administration comes, let the new administration take charge of that. That is one. Secondly, palliatives should go beyond just money. You mentioned part of it, providing transportation and all of that. But beyond all of that, we should see how we can also use policies to deal with the issue of palliatives. And when I mean policies, I'm thinking of things like our tariff policy. We should look at how we can tweak the tariff policy to favor some critical sectors of the economy that can, come up with production that will cushion, the pain that will bring down prices. For instance, in the agricultural sector, you can take a review of all the critical inputs in agriculture. Starting from poultry, they have challenges with feed mills, they have challenges with all sorts of things, with agrochemicals, with machineries, all of those things that can help us to scale up agricultural production. We should look at how we can use policies, tariff policy, issues of tax policy, monetary policy. So let us have those policy interventions to enable, the private sector to do a lot more in the area of food and in the area of some other services, in the area of power, for instance, in the area of transportation. So we can tweak our policies around that so that a lot more people can invest in those areas and bring down the cost, particularly the cost of staple foods, like bread, like noodles, like some of these things that the ordinary people consume. So beyond the cash transfers, it is important to also use policies to deal with all of these things. And of course, in all of this, we need to also engage with some critical stakeholders. So those things are not mutually exclusive. The cash transfer, if you have a more credible data, can be used in conjunction with these policy tools across the whole range of economic policy instruments.
So moving on from there, let's also look at this facility, as you said. The details are a bit scanty, but from our understanding, it is some kind of a loan. So the question then would be, given the fact that Nigeria already has so many loans we're attempting to repay, we have debt servicing costs that are really, really squeezing our ability to be in a financially better place. Do you think we needed to basically take a loan in order to extract ourselves from the subsidy? Could you see the subsidy removal happening without some sort of outside financial supports? Would we have been able to do this by ourselves? Is basically the question.
You see, we have gone through this road before. We had the Petroleum Trust Fund. it arose from issue of subsidy removal. And the logic at that time was that whatever savings we got from the removal of subsidy was plowed back into the economy by way of a whole lot of interventions under the Petroleum Trust Fund. At that time, the present president was even the chairman of the trust fund. We have had the Shopee under President Jonathan. Again, the framework was that whatever savings we got from the removal of subsidy was plowed back into intervention in form of Shopee. So that logic can also apply here. I don't see the reason why we have to again go a borrowing to be able to provide palliatives. Because one of the objectives of the subsidy removal was to make savings. And if in a whole year we are going to make a savings of close to maybe 6 trillion or 7 trillion, can get a portion of that for the palliatives. So why should we be going to, why should we go and borrow for that? Because the debt situation is already very, very bad. The economy is almost on the brink. We are using over 80% of revenue to service debts. This is not the time to be accumulating debts that we can avoid. So for me, I don't think there's any compelling reason to go and borrow for purposes of palliatives. Because the whole idea of the regulation of subsidy removal is inherently, to generate more money, to get some savings. And from that savings, you can apply it back in form of palliatives. So that is my view about that. And of course, we can look at other things. I mean, we have been talking about auto gas, for instance. How can we support individuals to convert their vehicles from using petrol to use of gas? We are blessed with abundance of gas, So these are some of the things, and of course, our power situation. If we invest more in power, the demand for all these petroleum products will reduce. Demand for diesel will reduce. Demand for PMS will also reduce. These are other bigger things that can be done to complement whatever we want to do. But coming back to the issue of borrowing, I don't think there's a very strong argument to support it.
So, Dr. Yusuf, I need to ask you this, because Nigerians hear a lot about market forces and what the real cost of PMS particularly would be. So let's say the subsidy was removed today, where we have an international price of a barrel of Brent crude being around $85 a barrel. We've pegged our crude benchmark at $75 per barrel with the budget, and the dollar is around 460 Naira. In terms of how much you would expect Nigerians to be paying, what should we be looking at? Because with the removal of subsidy, Nigerians need to brace automatically for an increase in price. What do you think the expected pump price, at the counter, at the pump, would eventually be?
Well, I think we need to deal with some fundamental issues here. You said that the exchange rate is $1 to, 460 Naira to the dollar.
Yes.
That is just academic. If you talk to practically all the players in the economy today, not up to 10% of them can access foreign exchange at that rate. The reality of exchange rate today is over 700 Naira. That is why some commentators, particularly those who are in the industry, were saying that if subsidy is removed, the pump price could go as high as 750 Naira. Now, the fundamental things that we need to do first is to ensure that there is level playing field in that sector. Because what we have now is a monopoly situation where only the NNPC is importing petroleum products. And even if you go back to even the production, presently, even though the refineries are not working, even if they were working, only the NNPC will be the main producer of petroleum products. So we need to move away from that monopoly situation. And the way to move away from it is to ensure that all the players have equal access to foreign exchange. If the CBN cannot provide foreign exchange for everybody at 460, let us adjust the exchange rate. That is why some of us have been talking about the issue of convergence of rates, the issue of a market reflective exchange rate, so that they can have an exchange rate regime that is more transparent, that is more equitable. So that if you have a situation where 10, 15, 20 players in the sector can go out there and import petroleum products, or can decide to set up refineries, this price will not be as high as this. So we need to create a level playing field where there will be competition, because the best way to protect consumers all over the world is to ensure that there is competition. Once you have competition, these prices will drop. All these exploitative prices that we have been paying for diesel, for aviation fuel, for kerosene, all these things will disappear, because people are just taking advantage of their monopoly powers. So that is what we should remove. And in addition to that, if you have investors who are committed to refining locally, let us use our fiscal incentives. Let's use our monetary policy incentives to support them. We can waive the import duty on all the equipment that they need, so that we can build local domestic capacity. These are the things that we can do.
Okay.
So I can't give you a price, but what I'm saying is that if you have a more competitive environment, then you are likely to have a more reasonable price. Certainly, it's not going to be as high as 750. These are some of the figures that have been scaring the citizens about the whole idea of removal of subsidy.
So I want to talk about the citizens now as we wrap up, Dr. Yusuf. So we've seen several false starts when it comes to removing the subsidy. There were protests when President Obasanjo tried to remove it in 2000, protests in 2012 when President Goodluck Jonathan tried as well. Interestingly, in 2016, we saw that the Buhari administration had no budgetary provision for subsidy, and that was the year that there was no subsidy payments before it was reintroduced the next year. There was also talk of removing subsidy earlier this year, but that plan was suspended. So given that there is no seemingly budgetary provision for subsidy beyond June, a new president and administration is coming in that says they should be removing it, but it seems the citizens themselves have not been carried along. How do we bring citizens on board this fuel subsidy removal train? Very quickly, because of time.
Well, there has been a lot of engagement, especially with the labor unions, because the labor unions have been practically the ones engaging on behalf of the citizens on this issue. In fact, there's a joint committee of government and labor on this matter, and they have been holding series of meetings and all of that. So there has been some level of engagement. There has also been some level of sensitization. But the unfortunate thing is that there is so much sentiment and emotions, so that these sentiments and emotions have practically carried out even the very sound economic arguments that are inherent in this proposition. So I think the new administration will have to also engage. I'm hoping that the administration is coming with some goodwill. The engagement has to be deeper, and these palliatives have to be properly, put in place, so that everybody will be on board, and we look at how we can ensure that, both the cash transfers, the policy component, and all of that. All of those things are brought to the table. So I think with proper engagement, we can move forward on this. And I also like to appeal to labor, because we need to have an economy before we will have any other thing. The economy is on the brink, and this is certainly not sustainable. A fragile economy cannot support the kind of bill that is coming from subsidy. A fragile economy cannot support this bleeding. So we need to appeal to labor to see reason, and let us work out a phased strategy, because certainly this thing cannot be removed at once. It has to be phased gradually. And these are some of the things on which there can be proper engagement. Okay.
All right. Dr. Muda Yusuf, CEO of the Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprise, thank you so much for joining me tonight on Politics HQ.
Thank you very much.